Let's take a look at another contemporary case. Your fellow board member, Michael Ratner, who couldn't be here yet this evening, will be arriving later, has been involved to some extent in a case that involves the United Nations in Haiti, where in the aftermath of the earthquake, a cholera outbreak took place, in which there is some evidence that the source of that outbreak may have been United Nations peacekeepers there. And there's a question of whether the United Nations bears responsibility, should admit fault, and if so, what actions should be taken. As I said, Michael Ratner isn't here. I invited him to speak about it. But his colleague who has been involved in this and a former fellow of the center, Brian Concannon of the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, is with us. And Brian, I wonder if I might call on you to give a brief synopsis of the situation in Haiti. These folks are not experts on it. They're not going to be able to comment on the specific details, but may be able to hear a little bit about it and then talk about what some of the issues involved might be.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Should I just stand here? Sure. Should we continue? Actually, adding to that introduction, I also, like the panelists, served with the UN at a much lower capacity. I was an entry-level human rights officer through the UN volunteer program in Haiti. The case, as Dan mentioned, the case is about cholera that was brought to Haiti by peacekeepers with MINUSTA, which is the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti. And it was brought there in October of 2010. Since then, it's been the worst cholera epidemic in the world. In aggregate, it's the worst cholera epidemic in modern times. About over 8,000 people have died officially. Many more have died unofficially, and it's still going. There were 1,000 deaths in 2012, and in the last 3 months, the rate is much higher than it was of deaths than it had been the same 3-month period in the previous year. And we filed a claim with the UN claims unit, both of MINUSTA in Haiti, but also with the Secretary General's office. And on behalf of 5,000 victims of the cholera. And it's a mixture of people who lost family members and people who themselves got sick and recovered. We filed that in November of 2011. Then just 2 weeks ago, we received an office from actually Mr. Corell's successor saying that the UN would not, they said our claims are not receivable. And because of UN immunity issues, we did not file in a national court, but the UN, in return for its immunity, it agreed both in the agreement it has with Haiti and in several other international instruments that it has an obligation to provide an alternate mechanism. And just to kind of put things in the boxes that Mr. Corell was talking about, this is not a criminal case. We're not making any criminal allegations. We're also not making any allegations against individual peacekeepers who had the cholera. The reason, and this goes to Mrs. Sorensen's comment about accurately assigning where the blame is, the reason for that is that the causes of the cholera epidemic in our thinking are really two things. One, that the UN protocols do not call for people to get tested who are coming from an area where there's an epidemic to an area that's very vulnerable to that, or to be treated. So these are peacekeepers who were from Nepal where there was an epidemic and they were deployed to Haiti without being tested or treated. The second reason why, even that probably would not have led to an epidemic, except that there was sewage at the base where they were deployed, was piped directly into Haiti's largest river system, and then it got quickly into the river and spread throughout the country. And so our claim is that it was the UN Engineering Department which did not do a good job of maintaining the sewage, and that the protocols of not testing and treating peacekeepers were themselves problematic. And in fact, as with the oil for food, the UN actually did appoint a committee of experts, 3 experts who studied the case, and they made recommendations that protocol should be changed. That recommendation was made in May of 2011 and has not been changed. They made recommendations that the sewage sewage treatment on the base be upgraded, and that has not been implemented. There's been some upgrades, but it's not, the problems have not been, their recommendations have not been fully implemented yet. And so we filed with the UN, and because the UN's immunity, and we did not challenge immunity, the reasons for it, or the fact of the immunity, but the UN decided that it would not take our claim, and the reason it gave in the letter last week was under Section 29 of the Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the UN. And Section 29 is actually all about compensation for contract and what they call claims of a private law nature. But they basically said our claim was not a private law nature because it involves policies rather than a normal private law claim such as a car accident or an assault by an employee. We think it's problematic that the UN put it in the policy basket instead of the private law basket for two reasons. One, if pumping sewage into the river is a policy, that's obviously problematic, if it's policy instead of a mistake. But second, if you're allowing that to be defined as a policy, that is an exception that will swallow the general rule of the UN compensating for harms, because then you can call anything a policy. You could call a car accident the policy of how cars are maintained or drivers are trained. And so we're concerned about both those two. We're preparing our response. We're going to make those points to the UN, but we're expecting that the UN is not going to respond favorably to our claims, and we're actually preparing a case for a national court. And I'm sure that you guys and women can tell us that there's lots of obstacles. We've got a lot of hurdles to go over to get into a national court, but we think we have a chance, and there's especially some jurisprudence coming out of the European Court of Human Rights. None of the cases involving the UN itself, but several other international organizations where they say immunity cannot mean impunity. And so that if an international organization forecloses all remedies for the victims, then then national courts should decline to enforce the immunity provisions.
Great. So thank you for laying that out, Brian. Again, we're not going to be able to get into the details here, which you're not familiar, but I am curious about your thoughts about the question in relation to this, about the extent to which acknowledgement on the part of the United Nations is either possible or important in situations where some kind of action may have led to significant harm, either in relation to this or something similar. Anybody want to try to take this on?
Thank you. As you heard, I'm not familiar with the details, and of course it would be wholly inappropriate for me to comment on acts that have been taken on the advice of my successor, because I know that they make a very, very thorough analysis in the legal office before a decision is taken. But what can I tell you are my own experiences, for example, in Rwanda, where the UN was asked to pay compensation for various reasons. And of course, as soon as there was a matter where it was clear that the UN had a responsibility, for example, a car accident where a UN vehicle had caused injuries to somebody by reckless driving or for some reason, immediately, of course, we offered compensation. But then when there were discussions whether the UN should be held accountable because of the troops in Rwanda had not been able to defend individuals, then we sort of pulled the curtain, because that is simply not possible, for the simple reason that here states contribute people, men and women, and they come in harm's way to do the best they can. If then the organization should be held accountable because these people are being sort of shot or they are losing the battle, as it were, and in particular in Rwanda, where the force in Rwanda was not designed as a striking force, it was a peacekeeping force to supervise the implementation of a peace agreement. And that's a completely different. And I remember that when I was involved in discussions with the Security Council on a mandate for the peacekeeping operation and the force that was considered, I was very concerned to first listen to the political discussion, to the reasoning of the Council, and look at the mandate they contemplated. But then when they came to the force, I always talked to the military and said, as a military expert, is this force strong enough to fulfill the mandate that the Council considers here? Because if not, the Council is putting men and women in harm's way. And that, I think, is a very, very delicate element. And here again we come back to this question, who is responsible? Who do we mean? And I can recommend you an article, a lecture that I gave in San Diego. It's on my webpage. Just Google my name and you'll find it. And the title is, Who Needs Reforming the Most? The United Nations or its members? And there is also finally a letter to the Security Council and the members of the United Nations on the 10th of December 2008, the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, where the title is Security Council Reform, rule of law more important than additional members. To me, this is so important. Thank you.
I'll say one more.
Okay, I will say something.
If ever there was a case of unintended consequences, this is it. You have to know that the peacekeepers were going to do the best they could. The circumstances in terms of sanitation throughout Haiti are very poor. The UN has been in Haiti for a long time, trying to help in health and education and safety and everything else. It's the most difficult situation. In my view, acknowledgement of what happened would be important, and to say that we'll do the best we can on the health issue. But as far as compensating individual people, that just seems impossible. I can't imagine how one could ever do that or identify what was owed or to whom or anything.
An editorial in our local newspaper, the Boston Globe, within the last couple of weeks called the decision not to acknowledge cold but correct. That is to say, cold because it seems heartless not to acknowledge responsibility, but correct in the sense that the editorial, the op-ed writer was concerned that that this might have a chill on other United Nations operations around the world. That if other large-scale operations, countries might be hesitant to commit their people, or the organization might be hesitant to commit their people if they felt that they were going to be held responsible for every action that happened. Is that a line of argument you find compelling?
Well, certainly I think it is compelling. I think the United Nations is always cash-strapped. It's never got enough funds to do what it should be, what it would like to be doing. And if one of the reasons for immunities, but where does the UN money come from? It comes from member states. And if the UN accepted huge liability, it couldn't pay if member states didn't cough up, and they're not going to. So that's the reality of the situation.
But then, on the other hand, you're not concerned about the credibility of the UN as an organization in countries around the world if they feel that the back has been turned. Do you want to comment on this?
Yes.
No, isn't that a fund being set up? Or?
Well, I don't know if there is a fund. For me, there are two things. There is no doubt that the UN cannot pay for a number of reasons. But at the same time, it is a matter of principle to help member states screen their staff, civilian or soldiers, before sending them overseas. Even in bilateral relations, usually, at least people I know most, French and British, brief their soldiers and diplomats before sending them on the field. So what happened in Haiti is very interesting. Not compensation, but at least acknowledgement or a way to do it to help our own staff be more accountable. There is a case not very well known, which was in a very sensitive organization, UNICEF. I think they were trying to get water in Bangladesh a few years ago. And in the treatment of water or whatever, no, they were digging for water, and it was arsenic in that water. And it was terrible. And so the intention was good to bring water, but they found arsenic and people were dying. What to do? So I think it is very important to find, through good lawyers, a way to acknowledge and not to say. But just to say we are UN, we are not responsible, is not good for UN. And especially today, where everything is on internet, everything is magnified, we have to find a way.
Brian, the Secretary General did announce a program for improvements in sanitation throughout Haiti recently. Exactly how it's going to be funded is still a question, but they did announce that. And would a combination of an active program to address sanitation needs in Haiti and some form of acknowledgement without compensation to individuals, would that combination be one that the people you represent would find compelling?
They might. We'd have to. There's 5,000 people. We'd have to consult with them about that. I think they would certainly find it compelling. And that's the easy part. But it hasn't been done. I mean, there's been no. President Clinton, who's the UN Special Envoy to Haiti, he did concede that the UN troops were the proximate cause of it. But there hasn't been. I don't think that's legally binding on the UN, and there's been nobody at the Secretary General's office who has said that, or the legal office, who has acknowledged that. And in terms of, I think that right now cholera is killing about 1,000 lives, and there's probably another 3,000 lives that die of 3,000 people who die of non-cholera waterborne diseases. So if you put in the plan that Dan was speaking of, that would save about 4,000 lives a year, which would obviously be a big deal, would immediately solve Haiti's #1 public health problem. And I think that all Haitians, including our clients, would be very excited and would find that very compelling. The problem is where 2 years and almost two and a quarter years into the epidemic, that plan, the details were just finally announced last week, and the plan is 10% funded, of which 9% of that was repurposed grants from other things. So there's a great concern among everybody in Haiti that there is not a serious funding mechanism in place, at least not one in proportion to the cost of the disease. And what Haitians will tell you, I mean, everybody's of course is concerned about costs. The peacekeeping mission in Haiti, and it was interesting that Ambassador Bell was talking about the peacekeeping mission in the Congo being there for 60 years. In Haiti, so it's been there for 8 years, but Haiti has not had a recognized war in any of our lifetimes, and the mission is now spending about $640 million a year. And there's lots of people who say, well, if you cut the mission down in half, then that would pay for the yearly cost of putting in this cholera program.
That is another story. In Africa, they have been always saying that. No, that is another story. Because people who give money for peacekeeping will not hand it over. It is mostly in equipment for their own soldiers, transportation for their own. It is recycled money, more or less.